2020 will mark Fernando Alonso's third attempt at the Indianapolis 500, and my goodness, the journey to this point has certainly been interesting. With the 104th running of the race on the horizon, let's have a look back at one of the latest and one of the most interesting stories that the Brickyard has seen throughout its history. Today, we're talking about Fernando Alonso at the Indianapolis 500. Fernando Alonso made his Formula 1 debut with Minardi in 2001 and punched in some relatively competitive results in an otherwise uncompetitive car, with the best result of the season coming in Germany with a 10th place. Having impressed enough in his first season, Alonso moved to Renault for 2002 as a test driver and would eventually get a race drive with the team for 2003. This partnership would produce 2 World Championships in 2005 and 2006, and well, that's kind of the best it ever got. Yes, Fernando would win more races in Formula 1 with the likes of McLaren, Renault again, and Ferrari, but he'd never win another championship. Sure, he came close a few times, but he'd never quite enjoy the same success that he did in the early 2000s. Well, not yet anyway, but we'll come to that. Come 2017, Fernando Alonso had found himself at McLaren for a second time. The last few years had been difficult at the best of times. You see, while he is talented, Fernando Alonso has typically been only somewhat healthier for the workplace environment in a race team than it would have been to put Uday Hussein in a race seat. That's probably the reason his relationship with Ferrari fell apart. He also joined McLaren just before they entered one of the biggest competitive slumps that the team had experienced since it began. Alonso was very vocal about the seemingly unreliable and gutless Honda engine, which we'd later discover was more or less McLaren's fault, and it seemed that the team environment was quickly becoming toxic. It made for a perfect, not perfect storm, and McLaren would finish second last in the 2015 F1 Constructors' Championship, and Alonso would only score 11 points. 2016 was slightly better. McLaren would place 6th in the Constructors' Championship, and Alonso would score 54 points. This still wasn't good enough for Alonso though. Nando needed something fresh, and one of the perks of driving for a big team with a big budget and the backing of a car manufacturer is that opportunities to do cool things are never far around the corner. Now, a short history lesson, on top of the short history lesson we're already doing. Graham Hill is the only driver in history to achieve the unofficial Triple Crown of Motorsport. As many of you may know, this consists of the Monaco Grand Prix, the Indianapolis 500, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. At some point in early 2017, Nando decided to embark on a mission that would cement his name in the history of motorsport. He was going to become the second man ever to achieve the Triple Crown. While he had already won the Monaco Grand Prix, he still needed an Indy 500 and a Le Mans win. I mean, Indy was surely only a matter of turning left. How hard could it be? For a 500 run, he needed a ride, and given McLaren's relationship with Honda, it was only natural that Nando drive a Honda-powered car, and Andretti Autosport was one of the best Honda teams in IndyCar at the time, and still is for that matter. But there was a minor problem. Andretti were already running 4 cars for the full season, and were also running an additional 2 cars for Michael Shank Racing with Jack Harvey and Stefan Wilson. However, on the basis that Wilson was promised future IndyCar opportunities, he stepped down to make way for Alonso. And so, on the 12th of April 2017, it was announced that Fernando Alonso would contest that year's Indianapolis 500 under the McLaren Honda Andretti banner, and the racing world went wild. Alonso would be missing that year's Monaco Grand Prix in favor of racing at Indy, and his seat would be filled by the recently retired Jenson Button. So came the month of May, and the entire racing world turned their eyeballs to face Fernando. 2 million people tuned in to watch Alonso's first test at Indy. Alonso would be strong throughout the entire month of May. He topped the rookie orientation test and would often find himself in the top 10 in the practice sessions. Come qualifying, Alonso massively impressed, making the Fast 9 and qualified 5th for the race, putting him on the second row of the grid. The stage was set for an awesome race. So the green flag flew for the 101st running of the Indianapolis 500. Alonso would drop back in the opening skirmishes, but by lap 36 he was in the lead. On lap 53 there would be a monumental accident involving Scott Dixon and Jay Howard. Both drivers were okay, but because of the amount of debris on the track, the red flag came out with Alonso still in the lead. Alonso would lead the field away at the drop of the green flag on lap 61. Throughout the race, while Alonso would lose the lead from time to time, he would remain competitive and spend most of his time towards the front of the field. However, Alonso's Andretti teammate Ryan Hunter-Reay would drop out of the race on lap 136 with an engine failure. Charlie Kimball would also drop out of the race 30 laps later in his Chip Ganassi racing machine, also powered by a Honda engine. Now, while it was commonplace for Honda engines to break down in Formula 1 during this time, it was pretty rare to see an issue like this in IndyCar. IndyCar engines are pretty reliable in general, be it Chevy or Honda, and if a car retires, it's not usually due to a full-on engine blowout. But 2017 hadn't been particularly good for Honda. Honda had tried to increase their power over Chevrolet during the off-season, but reliability issues surfaced as a result, and quite a few of them had sprung up during the month of May in the lead up to the race. What was happening to the Hondas in the race was certainly a cause for concern, but Alonso was still running strong. In fact, minus Hunter-Reay's engine blowout and Jack Harvey crashing out, it was turning out to be a pretty good race for Andretti Autosport. But in a stroke of wretched luck, with 21 laps remaining, Alonso's engine would let go, coming onto the front straight. As smoke poured out the back of his car, Alonso would hug the pit wall and grind to a halt just before turn 1. His race was over, but Alonso had driven admirably and had garnered the respect from the IndyCar community during his time in Indianapolis. As a disappointed Fernando climbed from his car, he was met with thunderous applause from the crowds. 2017 was ultimately a tale of irony. Alonso sought a temporary escape from Honda's reliability issues and McLaren's uncompetitiveness in Formula 1 by going to Indy, only to suffer the same fate as he would in Formula 1 for quite a few races in the 2017 season. On top of this, it would later surface in the season that Honda's IndyCar reliability issues had come as a result of a failure of a part that had been used in Honda's engines for 3 years up to this point, but had only started causing problems that year. While it wasn't fully disclosed what that part actually was, it was most likely a part in the internal combustion engine. Furthermore, Takuma Sato would win the race for Andretti, of course with the Honda engine, which, if that weren't ironic enough, according to our guest, who we will introduce later, apparently Sato and Alonso's engines were swapped before the race, a choice that probably altered the course of modern racing history. On a side note, after threatening to pee in Alonso's Formula 1 seat, Jenson Button would retire from the 2017 Monaco Grand Prix after colliding with Pascal Wehrlein, which, given the nature of that particular accident, he may have actually kept his promise. 2017 would mark the final year of McLaren and Honda's partnership in the turbo-hybrid Formula 1 era. In October of 2017, in the knowledge that McLaren would be running Renault engines in 2018, and in the hopes that he'd actually be competitive again, Alonso opted out of the 2018 Indianapolis 500 in order to focus on Formula 1. Let's not forget that Alonso had also committed to his WEC drive with the Toyota Gazoo racing team, in a bid to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And so we arrive at 2019. A lot has happened since Alonso's Indy 500 run. After another lackluster year in Formula 1, Fernando had decided to temporarily can his Formula 1 career. He was well on his way to winning the 2018/19 LMP1 championship with Kazuki Nakajima and Sebastian Buemi at the Toyota Gazoo racing team, and had won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in the process. He'd also had 2 runs at the Rolex 24 and actually won the race with Wayne Taylor Racing in early 2019. With the end of his Formula 1 career, it was like Mansell Mania all over again, although that's another video in itself. It was almost certain Fernando would return to the Indianapolis 500, but now, while it had only been speculation, a full-time IndyCar ride was certainly possible. While the latter would never come to fruition, the 500 was certainly on Alonso's and McLaren's mind. Now that his calendar had been freed up, only the Indy 500 stood between him and a certain place in the racing history books. However, as I said, while Fernando had certainly been busy on the racetrack, he'd also been busy burning bridges with Honda off it. So it looked like for 2019, Fernando and McLaren would have to run with a Chevy team at the Indy 500. Carlin had entered IndyCar the year before, and because of some pre-existing relationships between McLaren and Carlin, the two parties decided to enter a technical alliance for the race. Because Carlin was a Chevy team, it seemed like a pretty good partnership, but in reality, Alonso's second Indianapolis 500 attempt would prove to be far less impressive than the first, as our special guest, Kyle Cuthbertson from RacingNationTV, shall now explain.
From the moment Fernando hit the track at Indy, you knew something was up. McLaren had run a private test at Texas Motor Speedway in early April, but on April 25th, Fernando ran his first laps at IMS, and the day was just absolutely miserable for the team. with 45 minutes being lost due to weather and an electrical issue sidelining Alonso for most of the day. By the end of the test, Fernando had only completed 29 laps and would have to finish his refresher course once the official practice started about 2 weeks later. Fast forward to May 14th, opening day of Indianapolis 500 practice. In the early morning, Fernando went ahead and completed his refresher course, which is mandatory for the part-time entries. He covered 49 laps in the morning, but missed the afternoon session due to another electrical issue. Not the worst day one to have, but not the greatest either. If the first 2 days McLaren were on track worry you, then buckle up for day 3. On Wednesday, May 15th, Fernando would cover 46 laps in the morning, almost equaling the day before. Until exiting turn 3, Fernando pushed into the wall while following Graham Rahal and wrecked the car. Now, most of the time when you see a crash in 500 practice, you would expect a backup car on track either a few hours later or the next day. I mean, look at what happened on Saturday, just a few days after Fernando's crash, when James Hinchcliffe almost flipped in qualifying, but the team still managed to go for another run later in the day. Not only did McLaren miss the next day of practice, but once they got back out on track on the 17th, they would miss almost 2 hours of running because of a crash for Kyle Kaiser of Junco. McLaren did, however, complete 77 laps, the most of anyone on Friday, but their pace was still behind. McLaren went into Saturday qualifying mightily unprepared, but the team and most people thought that their pace would be better than it was. On Saturday, only the top 30 at the end of the day were guaranteed a spot. 31st to 36 would move to the last row shootout, with 34th to 36 going home. Alonso would make 5 attempts to qualify on Saturday, with the last of them being good enough for the top 30, but he was bumped back to 31st, which would mean that Fernando would have to participate in the last row shootout on Sunday. Fernando would have to take on his Carlin teammates Pato O'Ward and Max Chilton, as well as Sage Karam, James Hinchcliffe, and Kyle Kaiser. Both of his teammates from Carlin had been involved in accidents during the week, and James Hinchcliffe, who had missed the race the year before in 2018, was involved in a nasty crash in qualifying. Kyle Kaiser had also been involved in a crash on Friday. The story of Kyle Kaiser in 2019 is as interesting as McLaren's, as Juncos went to the 500 as a one-off, but unlike McLaren, resources were limited, and as during practice week they ran with an all-white livery as they had no sponsors. Even though they didn't have the proper funding, the team was looking really good on the timing charts until their Friday crash. After they crashed, their entry was actually in question, as nobody was sure if they had enough spares. By taking apart our road course car and Frankensteining it with bodywork, they somehow made it to Sunday. Rain on Sunday morning shortened practice from an hour to 20 minutes, which meant Fernando only had 20 minutes to practice before the shootout. They didn't even make full use of the session, as they put the setup on the car wrong, as it was bottoming out heavily. Once the clouds went away and the sun came out, it was finally time to qualify. In qualifying, Alonso was unable to beat Hinchcliffe's time, but was able to beat Chilton, which left O'Ward, who could possibly run the same time as Alonso. Karam was the wild card, and Kaiser had struggled. O'Ward then went out and ran slower than Alonso, which put O'Ward out of the race. Karam then went out and out-qualified Alonso amazingly, putting Alonso on the bubble. But with only Kaiser remaining, I think everyone in the stands, even me, was pretty confident at this point Fernando and McLaren had survived and they would be safe. That was until Kyle Kaiser went out and defied the odds, bumping Fernando Alonso and McLaren out of the Indianapolis 500, something you'd expect to happen in a movie, but certainly not in real life. Here's where it gets interesting. Once the dust settled, everyone who was curious on why McLaren had no pace at Indy got their answer, as Jenna Fryer of the Associated Press published a fantastic article where Zach Brown admitted to the mistakes that were made during the month. The article details embarrassing moments such as showing up to their Texas test in April without a steering wheel. They hadn't finished theirs at the shop, so they decided it would be a good idea to show up without a steering wheel. Did they forget a race car needed a steering wheel? For those curious as to why it took an entire day to get the car ready for practice after they crashed on Wednesday, that's because the backup car wasn't the correct shade of orange when they received it from Carlin. So they had to send it to a paint shop for the correct, quote, papaya orange. Instead of getting the car ready to drive, they were worried about cosmetics. Not only that, but after the team was slow on Saturday, Zach Brown admitted that he did this. He went to his old pal Michael Andretti to find speed, where he reportedly acquired dampers and setup help, which theoretically would have put them in the show. But during practice, when the car was bottoming out on Fast Friday, it's because the team didn't convert the units from inches to metric. As if that wasn't embarrassing enough, the setup actually ended up being fast enough to run 229s, which would have put him into the race. But the fools at McLaren put gearing in the car that limited it to 227 miles per hour. They could have qualified, but they defeated themselves, letting the little team that could in Juncos take all the glory.
After Alonso and McLaren's embarrassing showing at Indy, Alonso would go on to win the WEC and Le Mans for a second time with Toyota, but still, Indy stood in his way. On August 9th, 2019, it was announced that McLaren would partner with Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport for the 2020 IndyCar season. Because Alonso, McLaren and Honda weren't exactly on the greatest of terms, the newly reorganized team would run Chevy engines instead, bringing to an end a 13-year stint with Honda for Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport. The team would run 2 cars full-time, and a third car was planned for Alonso for the Indianapolis 500. So it looked like the lineup would be this. James Hinchcliffe would drive full-time alongside another driver, while Fernando would come in for the 500 in a third car. Well, Fernando had other ideas, and so did McLaren. Fan favourite Hinchcliffe thought he was sitting pretty with a new McLaren drive, and despite being the ambassador for Honda Performance in Canada, he could cut those ties to race with Chevy. However, McLaren had other ideas and decided to give Hinchtown the boot after all the good drives were taken, leaving him completely out of a ride for the 2020 season, meaning that he was unemployed and had damaged his ties with Honda. As Marcus Ericsson, who at the time was Hinch's teammate, left for Chip Ganassi Racing, the 2 seats were filled by IndyCar young guns Oliver Askew and Patricio O'Ward. While Hinch scrambled for some sort of a drive, Fernando looked at his reasonably appealing situation and thought, no. Yes, Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport was able to get a massive financial boost from McLaren, and the team occasionally scored wins and podiums even before McLaren came on board, but they had never won a championship, and more importantly, they've never won the Indy 500. But you know who has and can win the Indy 500? Andretti. Thinking that he, a man of Fernando's talents, would be able to land a drive easily, and more importantly, that his GP2 Honda engine comments were just water under the bridge, Fernando left his role as McLaren ambassador, information that went public on January 20 this year. Alonso then began talks with Andretti Autosport, and Andretti seemed happy with the idea of running him for the 500, and were very close to securing a deal. Apparently, an array of sponsorship deals were actually on the table. However, contrary to Alonso's expectations, Honda did not share the same sentiment as Andretti, and sent a command straight from the top that decimated his hopes for running the race with Andretti again. Obviously, if he wanted to run the 500 in 2020, Fernando would have to use Chevy engines once again. But who would he drive with? Team Penske had won the 500 2 years in a row with a Chevy engine, but they were already running 4 cars full time in 2020, and were planning to run a 5th car for Scott McLaughlin at the Indy GP, although this never came to fruition due to COVID-19. AJ Foyt were running 2 cars full time and a 3rd for Indy, and did not have the facilities or the resources to run a 4th car, and most of the other Chevy teams seemed rather unappealing for somebody who wanted to win the race. Then there was Ed Carpenter. While Ed Carpenter isn't the biggest team in IndyCar, on a good day they can be very competitive. Last year, the Ed Carpenter cars qualified 2nd, 3rd and 4th for the race, while Alonso failed to qualify. It seemed like ECR was Alonso's final option, but on February 11th, Ed Carpenter himself said that there would be no potential deal for Alonso. It looked like Fernando would have to sit out the 2020 running of the race. However, Fernando found a way. Because what do you do when you've left the roost and you're down on your luck? Exactly, you go crawling back to the roost. And so, Fernando Alonso showed up on Zach Brown's front porch begging for his old life back and with a dirty basket of washing in hand. On the 25th of February, it was announced that Fernando Alonso would be driving the 3rd car for McLaren Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport at the 2020 Indianapolis 500. The race would ultimately be pushed back to August because of COVID-19, but in June, McLaren released this bad boy on social media. The car that Fernando would be driving in this year's edition of the race. On a side note, Hinchcliffe would eventually secure a part-time ride with Andretti Autosport for the 2020 season, and will participate in this year's Indy 500. Also, Alonso recently secured a full-time drive with Renault for the 2021 Formula 1 season. Also in 2021, the Indy 500 and the Monaco Grand Prix will no longer be on the same weekend, meaning that he can do both races in the same year, but that is a story for another time. And so, with the 2020 Indianapolis 500 on the horizon, that is the story so far. Before we wrap up today, I just want to thank Kyle for joining us today and giving his insights. I'll just give him a second now to plug some of his pages.
If you're interested in IndyCar racing, sports cars, sim racing, or even dirt racing, then be sure to follow my channel, RacingNationTV, for coverage on almost all types of motorsport, as well as following me on Instagram and Twitter. I want to thank Jack for including me in this video. Talking about Fernando's 2019 Indy 500 run is kind of an interesting one. I was there in person. It was entertaining, to say the least. It gave us a lot to talk about last month. My boss, David Land, was there for the initial test. We all knew from that point on that it was going to be entertainment, which it is, and it still is today to think about. So go subscribe to Jack if you haven't already, and thank you.
And that's it. Do you think Fernando will win the Indianapolis 500 this year? If not, who's your pick to take victory? Did you enjoy today's video? Put all your thoughts in the comments below. I do actually read them all, so you may as well say something and I will most likely respond to you. All the socials are in the description below, including the TCR Instagram, Twitter, and Discord server, as well as my own personal Twitter. Please go check those links out if you haven't already done so. Anyway, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.